A friend of mine messaged me, reached out, and asked for my advice on how to respond to a commenter on a recent social media post. Um, which we could talk about that a little bit, but it's such a common question that I wanted to create a quick video because so many people struggle with this. But the context is my friend had posted on social media, which I celebrate and encourage, sharing a testimony of her daughter's healing. It's not really important, the details, but her daughter had a lump on her arm, and initially the doctors thought it was a bone cancer, a tumor on her forearm. And after a couple different rounds of biopsies and doctor visits and appointments, they were really worried and actually were looking to schedule surgery. And as we do here often in these cases, my friend reached out through her church and through her community and asked for people to pray. And to get to the punchline quickly on this case, she really feels like there was a miracle, that there was a supernatural touch from God, a healing. And when the doctors examined her one more time before what was looking like a necessary surgery to deal with this problem, they could not find it anymore. And ultimately, the young girl, teenage girl, is perfectly healthy and perfectly fine. And she was posting and celebrating that she really was, giving God honor. She was celebrating the fact that there was a miracle in her family. And it was a public post. And so, there was a commenter that said something along the lines, she sent me a screenshot, but it said something along the lines of, I guess your God doesn't care so much about all the kids that are dying from X, Y, and Z war or atrocity or famine or whatever they were citing. I guess, your case was way more important. How can you believe in a God like that? Now, we've all heard this line of questioning before, and this person was really just baiting my friend into a dialogue. But it's actually a very common question, and I've seen this so many times, and it's worth looking to the Bible for a great example. So, first things first, we should establish that God is just. God is justice. That is at the core of his being. For someone who is struggling with this question, we need to empathize first, because what they're seeing as a result of this testimony is injustice in God. They feel like when you share a miracle or a blessing or provision, and then when you attribute it to a God that's showing that mercy or that supernatural intervention, they perceive that as injustice, when in fact it's exactly the opposite. And without going off too much on a tangent, I want to make this video fairly short and concise, but that is ultimately the trap that Lucifer, the enemy, the devil, whatever you want to label it as, that is his ultimate trap. He always likes to turn it around. And so in an example of God's justice, he tries to make the hearts of sinners think that is in fact injustice. And so let's talk about that real quick. Why would God heal one person and allow babies and adults and elderly to suffer in the world? Why would he heal some and not others? Well, first things first, we have to establish, right, is that before sin entered the world, before corruption entered into the creation, there was none of these things. There were no dying babies in concentration camps. There were no elderly people suffering. There was no cancer. There was no pain. That is the biblical text that we know of. The world was perfect. Creation was good. But sin entered the world. And what is sin? So sin is disobedience. Sin is what separates us from God. And so by the fact and the very nature that sin entered the world through Adam, the Bible says, that ultimately began the process, and really an abrupt process, of separating us from God. And so the Bible has a lot of imagery, right, about the Garden of Eden. We all learned about that in Sunday school and varying degrees of biblical studies. We've looked at that story, and it gives us that image of distinct separation, that sin basically demanded separation from a holy God. And why is that? And again, we can talk about that quite a bit, but the short of it is God's holy. and he will not tolerate sin. He will not tolerate anything other than perfect holiness and righteousness. And so when we allowed sin to enter into our lives, inherently the earth, which was given to us, that separated us and the earth from God. And so what happens then? We're living in this world that is fallen, as we like to say, in a theological context. It's fallen. Really what it means is we're separated from God. And so what happens on earth is not the effect and the doing of God. It is the effect of a world that is separated from God. It is imperfect. It's not ideal. God's not looking at what's happening at the world and shaking his head, agreeing about every little detail, and certainly in the suffering of humanity. No, as a matter of fact, it's quite the opposite. He is grieved by it, the Bible says. And so because sin is in the world and in everybody's life, we have to deal with the consequences of that day by day. So how does that relate to the story here? Well, there is definitely injustice. There is definitely suffering. And many times, the most difficult stories are the suffering of what we perceive as the innocent. But the Bible does tell us, in fact, that because we live in this sinful state, there is no innocence. We are all inherently born into sin, and we live in a world that is inherited in a sinful state. And so all the suffering that we see, we can't attribute that to God. That's God's justice. God demands perfection. Man allowed sin to enter in the world, and so therefore we're separated from God, and that is why what's going on. So how does that relate to people then who seemingly get spared, like my friend's daughter? Well, that is, in fact, the supernatural intervention of God. I love using examples, and so did Jesus, because he's known for his parables. In the Gospel of Luke, chapter 15, we read of the story of the lost son, or some people call it the prodigal son. And it's a great illustration of how this relates to God's interaction with humanity. I won't read the whole thing, but if you want to read it, it's recorded in Luke 15. You have a dad with two sons. He obviously was wealthy. And one of the sons, presumably the younger one, basically demanded his inheritance. He's like, I want my money right now, Dad. I don't want to wait till you die. Some people say that was ultimately wishing that his dad was dead, and you can make a case for that. But ultimately, the story is he took his inheritance, half of what his dad owns, and his dad willingly gave it to him. He said, it's your choice. And he goes and he lives his life. He squanders the money. We all know the story. He ends up losing it all, ends up as a slave, a servant in a foreign land, ultimately cleaning, pigs' barn stalls, and is essentially left to feed himself with the leftovers of what his job led, when that was the food that the pigs were eating. And so he's in this sinful state. He's separated from his master. His master is still there. His dad is still there. He's still presumably wealthy. He still has his estate. His older brother's there managing the affairs, and things are well at home. But the son made the decision to leave his dad. And his dad loved his son, but love demands free choice. You can't say you love somebody and force them to do what you want. That's not love. We all know that. And so because the father loved his son, the younger son, the prodigal son, he let him go. He let him make his own decision. That he really felt like half of his estate was justly his. And so he let his son go and squander that money. And here's the difference. Here's where it ties into what this commenter on social media for my friend's post missed. When the son took steps to come back and acknowledge that he messed up, that he walked away from his dad, and that life was better, that I should have never left. The Bible says it describes it as he came to himself. He had an awakening. It says in Luke 15:17, when he finally came to his senses, he said to himself, at home, the hired servants have food enough to spare, and here I am dying of hunger. I'm going to go back to my father, saying, Father, I have sinned against both you and heaven. He's admitting he's wrong. He comes back. And what's the result? Well, the result is a supernatural miracle. His father accepts him back with open arms, throws a party, kills the fatted calf, puts a robe on him, puts a ring on his finger. Basically said, you're mine. I'm giving you your authority. I'm giving you your clothing. I'm giving your inheritance back. Everything that I have is back to you. And interestingly enough, there's an older brother that squawks at this, at the injustice. And he's like, what are you talking about? How is this just? And the fact is, that the Father says that anybody who makes attempt to come back, whether it's my friend asking for prayer in the light of the effects of sin, not that her daughter was sinning, not that she was sinning, but it was the fact that we live in a world where cancer exists because sin is real. And we live in a fallen world where cancer and death and suffering happens. But God is merciful. And in the case with my friend and the prayers of the people, and I don't know exactly why and the rationale, but what we do know is that God showed mercy. And so, in a sense, he broke his justice. Sin demands punishment. Sin demands what we have in the world. Yet he broke his justice by extending mercy. That is literally the message of the Calvary. That is the message of the cross, is that he puts justice aside because he's saying, I'm going to pay the price myself. And in the case of my friend's daughter, he said, by my stripes, you are healed, because I suffered physical harm on my back and my body and my brow, that your daughter could be healed. And they happened to tap into that, and it's a supernatural miracle, and she received her healing. Does that happen every time? No. But we live in a sinful world, and God's justice is what it is. And so when we get questions about why somebody suffers, why somebody doesn't, well, we know why we suffer. It's because we live in a sinful state. We live in a sinful world. Why does God choose to heal some others? It's because the prodigal comes home. He comes to God and says, God, I need you to intervene. And the Bible says that he's faithful and just to forgive and to meet our needs. And so don't get confused. God is just. He's always going to be just. Don't let people confuse you by leading you to think that God's justice is broken when innocence suffers. Suffering is in the world because of God's justice, because we have chosen to walk away from his righteousness, because we sinned, and because this world is in a sinful state.